I guess I'll just start. I mean, we'll just carry on with the conversation we had. I think one of the questions I have is with parametric urbanism, the way it's been rendered, the way I've seen it rendered, is as an almost homogeneous field of differentiated geometries. And I've heard you say, I know you believe that that's not the end goal. The end goal is that people articulate buildings within the conditions of that parametric approach, within that system. And so that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to develop unique geometries within that system that relate to that system, but also have their own kind of internal processes going on based on program or based on whatever internal to it.
My new take is slightly different.
Yeah.
You're taking an overall master planning approach, the massing, and then you come in the next step of articulation, you distribute these plots, and then you fill back to this with individual articulations. And my new approach is to do it without the master plan, to grow it bottom up with individual interventions, and yet presuming that the interventions share an ethos of discovering and continuing relations and continuities and emergent global orders. But they become unpredictable, and they're the outcome not in that kind of hierarchical master plan versus infill. Although, of course, when we had the master plan, this approach like you had when we worked on parametric urbanism, we would also allow, of course, that there's contingency with respect to the topography within the system, there's parameters. But I'm now looking for something much more radical, where you don't have a system with multiple parameters, but you have something truly emergent bottom up.
So how this is actually
as a presumption, as a positing, and I'm trying to do that with some studios. Semi-successful so far.
So how do you, if you're taking conditions from the context, you define the system that develops your building within that plot, how does it then affect outwardly? Once it's built, does it affect, it creates a new system?
In thousands of different ways, as long as the a priori is, it should affect. But how it affects is then up to the next intervention to define. Now the next intervention must be a parametric design protagonist, because that's what should be. It can't be postmodernist, nor it can't be minimalist. Then the whole thing falls apart. But if it is a parametricist, which I presume to be an a priori condition of a mature field, once we've overcome that degree of maturity we still have, where we have a unfinished discourse which allows for a lot of contradictory propositions to be in the mix. They have to be weeded out and we need to converge towards a set of principles. Under this presumption, I think you can imagine a bottom-up emergent order which has global coherence, generates path-dependent identities unpredictably, a bit like co-evolutionary process of multiple species and multi-species ecology, interfacing also with topography, with existing structures, emerging and delivering something which is unpredictable in its particulars, but we can predict that it will be some kind of, it would adhere to the principles of parametricism, which are very, very abstract in general, while at the same time cutting out everything which was ever going on in architecture for the last 5,000 years.
So what is your view on historic preservation?
I'm positive.
Yeah.
That should be integrated, can be. There's enough space and enough city space to keep urban districts, key elements and so on. That's not excluded, because that's my view is also not a tabula rasa approach, but some kind of palimpsest style integration. But within that you can leave historical ensembles preserved, and you can kind of also resonate and move away from them sensitively until you, at a certain distance, you mushroom into something very, very different. In London you can see it, the city of London.
What would you say to a proposition at a theoretical level of allowing no demolition whatsoever? You may build, but you may not demolish. Parametric.
It seems a bit arbitrary. I think one could have a heuristics, only demolish in terms of the cost-benefit analysis, pros and cons, but I wouldn't make it a priori. That should be up to the market to determine.
Yeah.
Whether it is worthwhile to burden yourself with an existing structure.
Well, I'm just thinking of it as a source of complexity.
Yeah.
In other words, rather than generate complexity.
I think it's a good heuristics.
Right.
We often did
Right.
this with our buildings.
Uh-huh.
We also want to show the potency of parametrism being able to integrate existing fragments, what we've done in Rome, what we're doing in our subtense secular.
So from an evolutionary point of view, it would be saying, maybe there are moments where you would clear the land.
It's a good heuristics.
But
It means it's
as
a
a heuristic, you go, all right, we don't demolish.
Yeah.
This is a mess.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
complicated.
So-
But from it, we must grow. And that, if your parameters are sensitive enough.
Could even be a kind of initial default condition, but
Correct.
it's not an absolute principle.
Like a terrain.
You talk about the city as a garbage dump or garbage spill.
Yeah.
You still feel this way? And how would integrating at such a bottom-up scale change that as a figure of the city?
Yeah, can I to add on this
Yeah.
question? Because you were talking about the emergence in like pure bottom up, and then you want to achieve some sort of order.
Yeah.
But then this order, if it's a meaningful order, it has to be achieved top down, right? Because so then the order achieved from this emerging objects is pure arbitrary. You have no idea what kind of order it will appear in the end.
It's not arbitrary. It's something which is self-computing, if you like. It's an evolutionary process. And I've come to believe that evolutionary process with rationals, like Dennett would call them free-floating rationals, being built in through incentive structures, through multiple criteria being at play, will forge efficient orders. Now, it's not true that you need a top-down. For me, the nature is the example. Nobody's designed the beautiful valleys with all the way the flora, fauna integrates with topography. So there isn't a top-down design, but there's certainly an order where these things correlate, relate, resonate. That would be
But Patrik, the nature we see today, that's, let's say, beautiful, is predicated on millions of years of destruction and death. Nature is cruel to itself. So you would have to sort of, again, I understand this to be somewhat of a thought experiment.
I'm just expanding it. Could there be
a
order
lot of these
without-
experiments will not work. There will be massive failures, which one has to, like extinction events, which the building system would have to recover from again and again and again for thousands of generations in order for the order to emerge. So you would have to imagine a building industry and a constructional system that was so resilient, so capable of regenerating itself from disaster.
Well, I just want to establish
this
one
would
point
happen.
at the moment. I want to establish the point that there could be in the field of the built environments, a global order or a sense of order which is contrasted with that arbitrariness of the garbage spill.
Yes.
And my examples would be, I could go to nature, but I could also go to the vernaculars. I could go to village settlements. I could go to historic cities which have no plan,
Right.
no blueprint, but a set of principles. And this is the
This
work
is
of
Christopher Alexander.
This is Alexander. This is Hillier.
Yes.
So and that is so for me that established that possibility.
So you would argue for a vernacular
No,
architecture?
not only the vernacular.
No, but it's
I'm
also-
talking about the
As
vernacular
long as
being an
it's
example of a
parametrically
bottom-up emerging order without top-down guidance.
So vernacular is always adapting to like kind of the natural environment, right? So what is parametricism adapting to is the market.
Well, the vernaculars are not only adapting to the natural environment, but they do. They're also adaptive to the metabolism of societal life. and adapting to criteria of efficiency and productivity and life-sustaining vitality. And that would, all these criteria are still at play today in the contemporary city. And but what is the key difference for me is with respect to the contemporary condition has ejected and rejected a strong hand of central planning, rolling out an urbanism, paradigmatically, let's say, Brazilian.
So house meets Paris, no more. Never again. Impossible.
I think we're not in that space. We have still planners around, but if you look at something like an outcropping like the City of London, you know that nobody's planned it, nobody's anticipated it, or any of the great metropolises. They are, in terms of the global outcome, they have not been anticipated, planned, wanted by anybody. So we're looking at that, and we can't step back to an imposition, I believe, of an overall top-down order, because whoever's trying to come up with this will generate a straitjacket which will be most probably the hindrance, false hypotheses. So you need to remain at agility of continuous trial and error testing, and that comes through a market process, I believe. But what I believe that our discipline can do, it can come in and allow the hidden programmatic order which these cities have, because the buildings are placed relative to each other, because they function relative to each other, because they seek each other's closeness, and they are in relations of synergy with respect to each other. When you put a particular hotel into a particular business district next to a series of offices, next to a series of retail potentials, and what kind of hotel we craft for this. So there's a programmatic bottom-up emergent order which comes through the market, and it would be all the more subtle and sophisticated the more we had actually entrepreneurial freedom. Because the programmatic order is compromised highly by planning restrictions which don't allow this to be teased out and found and discovered. But to the extent that it is, and you presume it to be more degrees of freedom for bottom-up emergent texture of urban offerings, our task as architects would then be to articulate this, to articulate that hotel with its affiliations to those business elements, these retail elements, this nightlife aspects, and that you can perceive those connections, those programmatic continuities and relations to radiate through the object and being embodied in the object. That would be our task. And I think if we would do that, we would grow a legible texture which has order, which means it has navigability, it allows us to orient it, and we can infer then back from the way this hotel is articulated, and it leads us to all those ingredients which initially motivated its location, and therefore are relevant to this location, and therefore need to be rediscovered and utilized for the visitor and guest of the hotel. And for that would be our task as architects to achieve. And if I would then predict that if we look at this top-down, if that's been going on for 20 years, with hundreds and thousands of interventions, you will see something which will give you a sense of intricate order and navigable order, and not that garbage still chaos.
So,
That's my hypothesis.
So, do you think that there are any preconditions that would allow for this kind of approach to, let's say, thrive? Whether it's infrastructure, finance, code, and can architects shape those preconditions, or is it?
Well, they can shape the two sets of preconditions. One is what is already on the way of being established, meaning entrepreneurial freedom, market processes unleashed you use the full, let's say, information processing and research and development and discovery capacity of market processes. That's one condition. So degrees of freedom and freedom on that count.
So no regulation would be.
Exactly. That's what we,
Okay.
this is regulations have to do. They're very problematic.
Okay.
The other element is precondition is that the discipline is actually living up to its own capacities in terms of computational empowerment, articulatory versatility and sophistication, and that our discourse and design culture is also a universally shared set of heuristics and principles and values. Because in the end, we're trying to create collectively. I'm hoping that we can collectively, as we're being dispersed and not holding hands with respect to each other on each project, but according to series of principles, we collectively generate a city which will have coherence. And so that is the second condition, which the first condition it's out of our reach.
Yeah.
The second condition is something which is in our reach, which is basically the discourse in which we engage. We need to win and establish that convergence, a little bit like the pioneers of modernism established convergence in the 20s.
And is that consensus or is it something else? Or do you
It's
think
some
within
kind
the
of
discipline?
consensus, yeah, of course.
It's
We need to
consensus.
aspire to consensus, because if we don't aspire to that, there's no point in talking.
It just, for me, I don't see how relevant is it architecturally, right? Because it's just like, instead of giving the criteria by the planning department, now we're facing the option to get the design requirements by the entrepreneur and the
Yeah.
market.
Yeah.
So how do you make sure this will achieve a more kind of correlated order than the other? Like, is architecturally is still the kind of, we are facing exactly the same brief. The brief is not changing. So
No,
how
the brief is changing. The brief will be much more brief of.
So it's still the brief is given by the invisible hand. We're not part of that process.
That's
so
right.
we are
but-
still getting the set of data of the
But
things.
there's a
design.
critical difference in the set of data. The data coming from the bureaucracy are, I would say, arbitrary, they're frozen, and they're not going to be that intricate, connective programmatic tissue, which the market can deliver. And that's what the market can deliver is much more congenial to the principles
But
and
it
aspirations of parametricism.
It doesn't matter. They gave you this black box. You have no idea how this black box was achieved. What's the data inside? You have no idea. I mean, we are not economists. We have no idea why the market made this decision. So how does it relevant architecturally?
The relevant architecture, because I think these briefs will be much more attuned to the context, for instance.
If I were to summarize, it's a,
Yeah. And we want to attune the morphology to the contextual morphologies.
So I understand, like a typical planning situation, you have a top-down set of rules that guide the development of each space before that space is even designed.
Yeah.
And what you're asking for is that those rules, all of the conditions that lead to that design, are embedded within the contextual objects surrounding it. And so that an architect would have to understand the dynamics in relationship to that site in its immediate context, and that would form the rules for any particular location.
The criteria.
The criteria
And
for
the
it.
rules would be.
It would change.
It would still be a creative act,
Right.
because there's many different ways you can relate elements to each other.
It would be a triple O exercise in a way, because you need to
got it in
the
there.
opposite of a relational
I
system
was
would be an overlaying, a top-down approach where everything has to fit within this network and just differentiate within it. But what you're suggesting is that you have to understand each of the buildings within this place, and you have to fully investigate the conditions, the capacities, the potential of each of those conditions before you even begin with your own object, your own building.
That's right, and I expect the entrepreneur, the developer, to do that on the programmatic side of things.
No.
There's
And
yeah.
because there's a reason why we all pull to the city. There's the reason why there's a kind of urban convergence, because we want to integrate our lives, we want to cooperate tightly, we want to connect up many different aspects into a tight-knit kind of.
And it's usually
Unity of-
usually the market historically has not been able to provide that. So even like if you go with Friedman economics or sort of basically libertarian economics, the market rules, the market is organic, the market knows what politicians can't know. I think this ties into a very familiar political economic argument. I think you're making that, I think you think that a parametric approach to architecture like dovetails into that overall sort of economic approach.
It has to. I mean, I originally
But
thought...
I would
when
have thought
started-
from your point of view, just as an advocate of parametrics, is that you would be better served by saying parametrics can operate in several political economic contexts, and not just one that's
I agree with
fundamentally
that.
libertarian
I agree,
at
it
the
can.
planning level.
Yeah.
So,
I can, but I believe something else.
yeah.
I definitely think that parametrism is the good solution for what I call post-modernist network society, would also under more social democratic regime. When we started parametric urbanism, we thought to make these coherent,
Right.
differentiated fields that we need more political power to push this through. So that would be a natural desire. But I also say, hey, we can, from an architectural point of view, indulge in wishful thinking of empowerment when the actual historical process evolves in a different direction. And then I had to say, hey, this is a real challenge for this kind of work. It seems to be this kind of urban models of a unified city making seems to be in contradiction with what's going on all around, but also with the underlying socioeconomic trajectory which informs what's going all around. So I had to challenge myself and say, hey, can I still aspire to that sense of coherence and order in the face of a presumed radicalization of market processes? And then I made a second step, put on my citizens and political theory and economic theory hat. I actually believe that the market radicalization is where prosperity barriers can be broken through. And then I'm at time. But I agree with you one thing. Yes, parametricism is anyway the best, the only way forward, even under that.
Okay.
So it's not.
But I just happen to know you're running
But-
into trouble with
but-
the libertarian economics of parametricism. I'm just
I
surprised that
don't,
you.
as an architectural theorist, I don't need to insist on it, but what is very empowering
Yeah.
is that I can show that parametricism can cope with that, whereas I don't believe that minimalism or modernism can cope with libertarian economics.
Well, I thought you kind of put together deregulation, which is external, and consensus, which is internal to the discipline. And which brings me to sort of think about what are the mechanisms of that consensus, and whether it's pedagogy, whether it's institutionalized, and how, because I assume that that kind of consensus is different from this kind of modernist consensus, because it's a differentiate, so it's maybe convergence. So how would academia be a kind of venue for, is academia a mechanism for that consensus, or what are the mechanisms for this kind of disciplinary consensus in your mind?
You mentioned them all. It's academia, it's institutions like this, like the AA, various schools, but it's also theoretical organs, lectures, writings, paradigmatic achievements in the build works. I mean, we've been on the road to this convergence. For me, this was very striking when we, in 92, 93, a whole generation of architects and students and young architects converged onto a new project, literally within weeks or months, where characters who've been doing all sorts of different things, the next term were doing one project. And whole of Columbia University, for instance, forged ahead in a coherent, you've been there.
Yes,
And that was very potent and very compelling, and everybody realized these are the ideas, these are the potential techniques, intellectually stimulating, design-wise empowering. That was a convergence which was pretty striking, very potent. And this kept going all the way through the 90s into the 2005 and so on. I think all the way to 2008-9. And then we had the crisis, and we had that breaking up and dissipating temporarily. So I think this convergence is possible. And it's not so different from the modernist convergence.
You don't think it's that
I
different?
don't think it's so different in terms of that level of abstraction as a global convergence. So if you look at the Bauhaus, and it could be very small people, it could be a handful of people, let's say, the way, let's say, out of the Eisman office, Greg and Kipnis, the summer what we have done at Zahas and giving a voiceover to this, a few people, then Jesse coming on board, coming from different, and it was enough to galvanize and electrify a whole global discourse. And look at the Bauhaus, look at Mies, Gropius, and Korb meeting in the Baron's office in 1915, and then the Bauhaus bringing von Duisburg, and the small group. And then the way this was, what they achieved in the 1920s, a series of manifesto projects, whether it's the Villa Savoie, the Villa Summerpulving, the Bauhaus itself, and then imagine how this expanded, how this took over. 1931, MoMA show, America, and 1950, 60, the whole globe, a total makeover. Every single architect in the world at every place was a modernist, because that was the global best practice of architecture. We need to aspire to this again.
But don't you think
if we take a snapshot right now of our current position, it's going in the opposite direction. I think there's a diffusion of different styles right now, and people are searching. You see a resurgence of postmodernism with a whole different ideology behind it. It's very superficial. It's not using past artifacts, but it's almost a representational version, which is an anti-technology stance. I mean, there's a rejection of technology happening right now.
And it should be absolutely. We have to become impatient with this. This is so
but what do you do?
Well, just point out, the culture of discourse has to shift.
Mm-hmm.
We can't, in a sense, tolerate this as a respectable position.
Is parametricism missing the dominant house? Does it not have a clear enough example of what parametricism is?
I think we have.
Yeah. What is it?
Great projects, whether it's FOA's. Yokohama Terminal as an early instance. A lot of our projects, Dongdaemun, Baku, Maxi, I mean, there's so many large projects. Galaxy.
But I think, just from what I've heard, I go to schools often, and I think it's very dense, parametricism. I mean, this book is very dense, and I think it's hard to digest for a broad audience. And what parametricism needs to succeed at a scale of modernism is a simple understanding. A very clear description of what it is, and that's what Dominant House did. What Dominant House did is very simple, very clear, it's digestible, many people can take it. Does it need that? If you want it to proliferate with such a huge audience, do you need to make your message?
And it was never built.
Huh?
It was never built.
It was never built.
It
It never had to be built.
Well, as I said, we have been on the right path, and we just need to get back to that path. And it's also, I think the Pluralism has matured enormously. It is very sophisticated. It has integrated all the engineering intelligences, new fabrication techniques and logics. Only we are integrating this.
Yeah.
Everybody else is letting this pass them by, ignoring it. It's like as if you want to study medicine and you've never heard about the genome project or gene therapy. Or never using various diagnostic instruments. It's just should be respectable.
Well, this is
position. So this is the immaturity of the field. It's really problematic.
It's not only our field, though. If you look at just the political discourse now with Trump, it's a rejection of qualifications. You don't need qualifications anymore for your job. And the same thing's happening through architecture. I think that people can expect to engage the pedagogy of the discipline without any knowledge of the discipline. You see it left and right. That's, I think, the FOMO resurgence, the anti-technology. So how do you...
So I'm coming in and saying we need a new... I'm taking a kind of meta-discourse. I'm talking about the discursive culture, which allows that to happen. The discursive culture which has a kind of anything goes pluralism, which says something, architecture is an artistic practice where anybody can come up with their own visions, ideas, and predilections. That's very, very mature. And I think the schools of architecture have unlike art schools, oftentimes there's not even a curriculum. There's no sense that the discipline has built up a series of theoretical resources which should be on everybody's fingertips, like the whole work of Virgilia, space syntax discourses, is something which should be taught. Now we don't have that. As if you have an engineering school and you've never heard of certain theories of structures, nor have you ever touched finite element analysis. This should be totally, it should be
I mean, I agree.
castigated as being beyond the pale. And that's where I'm coming a little bit impatient. Why is that so? My theory is, I think that when modernism and the canons of modern and the modernization project, which ties into this, went into crisis in the 70s and early 80s, we had to reset, restart. We had a much more open brainstorming conditions, much more art-like, bringing in philosophy, radical rethinking. We need, like in a brainstorming session, you nearly prejudiceless, throw in everything to challenge us. Where are we going? What's been wrong? To shape the field, and that spirit brought a lot of mavericks and intuitive protagonists onto the field, toying around with philosophy and so on. This was very productive and necessary. So I'm saying a certain discursive culture of the 80s, which I grew up in, was meaningful and important at that point. But then out of this, we had postmodernism, we had deconstructivism, we had neo-historicism, we had minimalism, and various forms of absorbing the work of Deleuze-Guattari, the work of Derrida, the work of Foucault, and out of this crystallize something. So the brainstorming session has to move on into something where you filter, select, invest, reinforce, cumulatively build up, and that was all through the 90s. So, and some schools evolved like this, where people, at the beginning was just toying around with nerve service and tools. Later on, they integrated structural logics, they integrated education logics, and so on. So that was on the right path, but the schools themselves had been not made that institutional shift. There was still this kind of free-roaming art schools. The A became that big model, and it was very vulnerable. Although the AA in the late 90s, mid and early 2000s was also able to bring along, but the underlying institutional structure, it could also fall away and disintegrate quickly, because the culture is still too freewheeling for the contemporary historical stage. That's my phrase of it.
So let me just throw one more complaint that you can fold into your complaints. We've had 40, maybe 50 years now of a field called environmental psychology or environmental behavior studies, 3 or 4 journals, an annual meeting that brings maybe 500 people together. This is a body of research that is completely invisible to architects, right? So as you say, we should have courses this, and that. It's a little bit of a plea for orthodoxy. There's an entire field that was actually once addressed to architects, which architects have managed to not take one thing. There are about 2 colleges now where you can take a course in environment and behavior or that kind of study. So I would just add to your what's going to make.
And you know the problem is that we don't have
I'm going to say, I'm going to agree with you at one level that there's something fundamentally wrong about how we're going about teaching architecture, or something missing. I'm not convinced yet that parametricism is the thing that pulls it all together. In other words, I think that there are definitely unifying perspectives needed. I'm super interested in parametricism, but I don't know that just simply insisting on how cool it is is really the case.
It's not about cool. Look, I'm just picking this up. I haven't invested myself in this particular form of research. I'm interested to look at it. But what I'm doing currently is I'm invested in what I call life process modeling. So where I'm building up agent-based
Yes.
crowd models, which are all about patterns of occupancy, with heterogeneous crowds, with location-dependent behaviors,
Right.
certain complexity of behavioral options which are triggered
Right.
relative to
So
where you
that's-
are. It's tied into the semiological projects I'm rehearsing. So I'm interested in this.
I think that's very excellent.
So that comes in, and it's a natural. And parametricism isn't just something which looks cool. Parametricism is like all great styles. There's a new set of repertoires and resources of form and space making. There's new methodologies, which is a lot of kind of data-driven methodologies where you can intake an information process and transcode a lot of information relevance. And it comes with the program heuristic. So how do we actually understand architectural briefs and programs, and how do we work with them?
Right,
And
but-
that's
okay.
where I'm talking about. Parametricism is no longer, modernism was talking about a series of, let's say, stereotypical program conditions which you can list in a schedule of accommodation. And then there's about kind of disposing them. And I'm talking about, in parametricism, it's about parametrically variable event scenarios. So we're not talking about a series of stereotypical institutions. We're talking about actually event scenarios which depend on the number of people.
But what would you say to...
I mean, to model this through agent-based
Okay.
systems.
What would you say, though, to, let's say, another style, call it just X instead of parametricism, which overlaps with you, like agrees with all of that, about agent-based modeling, about trying to capture like the wealth of psychological information that's out there. But its product is kind of boxes, a little bit boring.
Well,
What
why would
happens-
you
what's right?
constrain yourself to this? So the point is this: if
Well,
you want to,
Maybe people like it.
no, that's the kind of false humanism.
No, that's false.
It's a bit like if you wanted to, well, you're talking about structure. If you have only boxes to create structures, you're already so inefficient.
That's inefficient.
Totally inefficient.
Yeah. Let me try to.
Social relations is if you want to draw, if you want to create an intricate network of relations and spaces and nesting and one leading to another, and you only draw, instead of with a nice pulsating line pouring into corners, allowing a trajectory fly through from different directions, if you only do this, how far can you get? You know, you
so
competing,
far.
somebody is drawing
So-
like this. competing
Very,
with-
very far. Very, very
You
far.
can't get very far.
Well,
with
Very,
this.
very
let me defend it in that you
It's like
write.
taking a keyboard of a piano and saying, if only I could slide all the notes together. I could make
You
it
talk
like
about the
Yeah,
superiority of curves, right? The superior curve is having the curve is more superior to the line because it has more information, more degrees of freedom, more capacity. Again, I'll talk about triple O because if there were a line and a curve is triple O because it has more capacity to change, more capacity to affect, more agency in itself. So maybe you could talk about
So are you just rebranding parametricism?
maybe.
He's offering you a way. He's offering you a way to go.
I'm trying to figure out a way for you to get it.
The temptation is always very large that
Yeah.
you kind of just slap a new label on something and own this thing and then rehearse all the pros and cons. So that has to be resisted. The label is there. You can get in, and maybe you can have subsidiary styles within that. It's just a very, very broad, generalized overview.
But you and Mark and they try to detach the two, and Graham tries to separate the two as much as possible, but they're both built on similar theories of assemblages and agencies. And so I guess what I'm trying to argue is that there's a very small difference between them. If there's a difference, it's because philosophy covers everything, and architectural
Actually,
theory
where
doesn't.
I positively relate to some of the insights or statements of Triple O, which is this idea that an entity which you posit, which might be a space, a building, a path, would, I think, initially I would say that's in a relationist sense, why relationism is so beautifully tied in with parametricism, that we want these things to not be isolated. We tie them in. The path is dependent, is a function of the topography, but as well as of the objects, which influences. So there's a kind of discourse of things inter-aware, inter-influential, and something becomes adaptive to many factors, and the more the better, the more the merrier.
Yeah.
And so that's, but at the same time, you can't always think them always through all the way to begin with, so you have to allow that positive element which you have thought through with respect to a number of relations as excess relational capacities and powers which exceed that which I've been thinking through and can name and point to, but also what the current life process hooks up to and onto. So that's the kind of it's like evolutionary, it would be pre-adaptive advance. It has additional powers, so that is a kind of that's withdrawn at that point, and these capacities could be surprising, could be challenging, could be excessive, and so on. And that's important insight and reminder. They're not. It's never fully reducible to what I've already known in the way I say, but it doesn't upset relations. It's just the potential of uncharted new relations, and capacities and impacts we're interested in. And yes, I think that's something, it's a good reminder, something also we have already methodologically rehearsed and went through. I'm not sure if you're aware of some of the work in the mid-90s, Brian Masumi, who's Deleuzian, who comes in about the concept of virtuality, or there was a whole competition by Any Magazine, The Virtual House, which is precisely about this, that you would fill a space with articulatory riches, with structure, with access, compared to an empty space, without at that point having any understanding of the details and capacities and options and affordances which you implant. But we're reckoning with that emergent, spontaneous appropriation, that unpredictable impactfulness of positive structures and features and morphologies. We had that in the discourse, and I feel that this is pointed towards by OOO, some of the theorizing, but it doesn't mean, well, I know that already. I have that already. We've been into this already. And so I accept it, and it's interesting, but for me it wasn't a shock of the new. It's just this, I know that already.
Let me try to tie this back into the first conversation in parametric urbanism, because what I appreciate about parametric urbanism is that it does create a figure, it creates an object larger than the human's perception. So like city like Paris has an identity that one cannot perceive in its whole. It's what Tim Morton would call a hyperobject. It's bigger than, it's all-encompassing, it's bigger like a nuclear bomb, for example, you can't perceive it, it's much larger. It's an assemblage of things and effects that are wrapped within not a specific boundary, but a boundary that contains those conditions. And so that's what I liked about parametric urbanism, because it creates a figure of the whole in a way that I think is OOO also has an effect, because the city has an effect, even though it is just relabeling, but
just rebranding.
But I wonder if you lose that, if you lose that and everything becomes now bottom up. This is new to me. I didn't know that you were feeling this way, so I'm curious about it. If everything becomes bottom up agency that affects local relations, will you ever achieve the larger whole, the identity of the whole ever?
Well, let's say it this way, it's the tendency of bottom up, you need to see what's possible. I'm not excluding that there could be, and that also ties in with in the libertarian economy, in the libertarian society, that you have free association, that you have, for instance, landowner associations, also using not only market processes, they're also using negotiated collective action propositions, as long as it's not with force, and that could also they could then draw on an architect and amplify an emergent order and then reinscribe it, or that master planning is forever excluded. I also don't believe that, so there could be a dialectic of some master planning, some curation if you have large consolidated sites. So I'm not saying that forever a top-down perspective is excluded. It's also something a researcher would then discover, and then one could kind of, as I said, pick up and reinforce. It's just tendentially that we have to show that architecture could actually cope with a lot of bottom-up, could aspire to orders and integralness without the empowered top-down hand. It's not excluded, but I want to include now the potential of a bottom-up I think emergent order being within the capacity of a discipline to think through and be congenial with. That's where I'm coming from.
So for me, there's even though I have a lot of critique of parametricism, I do think it's opening doors very correctly and very well. But I have a feeling that the territory being open is actually quite vast, and may or may not have the formal consequences you prefer. And
I don't have aesthetic sensibilities. Should be recrafted to what I'm confronting as the vital and viable. So I'm not have a big prejudice there.
Because I think it allows other architects to pursue.
I think the space to open up is much vaster than everything which came before. All the previous styles put together have less versatility and creative play than that space. Shall we get the audience in, by the way?
Yeah.
Well, let me just fill in a little bit here. It seems to me that the vocabulary that architects have to deal with, let's just put it very bluntly, walls, floors, ceilings, lighting, piping, is actually very, very, and a very impoverished description of what buildings are. Like, I don't care how curved they are, or how soap bubbly they are, or how straight they are, quite frankly. Doesn't matter.
Then you're mistaken, you don't know your discipline. Because we working through form. And if you think form is irrelevant, there's something seriously amiss.
I don't think it's irrelevant.
Sorry,
I think they're
tough on you.
You are. No, you're being sweet to me. But I think there are things to visualize and to see which are not those things. So, for example, isovist fields are a perfect example. You cannot see isovist fields, you feel them, and you need a computer to see them.
But don't you think that curves would most probably deliver a more visually permeable space with less hidden corners.
That's easy to do. Just do a field of columns.
Well, you should listen.
Or do no columns at all.
I'm not going to do that now, but listen to I have a lecture where there's a certain part where I'm explicating the superiority of curves.
Yeah.
I highly recommend that.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you want to say?
I like curves.
No, I was just saying like it's funny because you just said you don't care about the final form as long as their start point is this kind of parametricism criteria.
Yeah.
So how you end up with it's exactly the question before, like if the result is straight, you have to admit it's straight, no? Like
I don't believe you.
You keep claiming you don't care about the form, and then in the end your whole
and then suddenly you tell me
and the whole argument is based on
what would I know about architecture if I don't?
But it's also a question of legibility.
But I just simply don't believe that you would, in a very complex site with mixed use and complex relationships and trajectories, you would deliver with the minimalist vocabulary the functionality we are aspiring to, as efficient, as intricate as with a more expanded repertoire. It's simply like this: if you have only a vocabulary of 100 words, the kind of essays you can write are much more limited in scope and intricacy than as if you had 1,000 words.
No. That's like saying I can only make music if I have a gigantic orchestra and not a keyboard or a flute. There are the presence or absence
you can make
of
very
music.
simple music with on a flute with
very beautiful.
But
it's also interesting. You brought up language, right? It doesn't matter which language you speak, English, Spanish, but what matters is the meaning, right? So it really doesn't matter which language you use. It's the meaning you're trying to deliver, right?
Yes, but
So it's the
but certain meanings are inaccessible to simple languages. So that's clear. That's if you look at that's been
DNA is written in 4 letters.
I'd be curious to know, this is the same thing with parametricism in general.
okay. I want to see these guys coming in.
Let's do it.
We wait for the challenge from the
But
audience.
also another thing, like when you mention sorry guys, when you mention language, you can't mention a language without accent, right? So you don't give the tolerance as
should be
parametric to for different accent to come in.
Accent is not adding to it's an inflection which is translatable without residue. But if you go from a very simplistic language with 100 words and trying to recuperate meaning potentials of a language with 1,000 or 10,000 words, just can't be done.
I want to know where the line is drawn, because when does it become music? Where the line is
Where the
drawn?
curve is drawn.
If it's a grade, it's differentiated. Where's the singularity where suddenly it becomes parametric? I mean, that would be. It's the same with the city. Like, when do you stop identifying it as a field? When
Yeah,
does
the
it become-
legal boundaries.
When does it become discrete objects?
That's what you do is you take the legal boundaries.
I mean, this is a rhetorical question.
Okay, guys,
Yeah.
come on.
Questions? You got one?
Oh, you have questions, right? You had to prepare
Gregory
questions.
Gregory's had a question for about 20 minutes.
No. I heard you prepared questions. Come on.
Back there. Go ahead.
Fair. I was intrigued by
Prepared
your
like
comment
mustard.
about like the rise of modernism, right? You have these group of individuals, and then by 20 years later, it's all over the world.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering if that's possible or relevant now. I mean, like 100 years ago, you have a group of men and women take over the vast part of the world, right? The Bolshevik Revolution.
Yeah.
Like, is comparing now to then even worthwhile? I mean, to be so dogmatic in one style, I don't think that will ever happen again. I don't think you'll ever see like a group of people just dominate the world. And like, I just feel like that's what you're putting forward as what will happen with parametric design. And I don't know if
Okay, it doesn't rely on dogmatism. Wouldn't be convincing. If you look at progress in science, certain, Darwin's theory of evolution is one guy shaking it all up and spawning a discipline which now everybody's an evolutionary biologist. It's part of the DNA in inverted commas of. So that there's nothing dogmatic about it. It's just compelling. It's insightful. It shifts. Similar things. Whether it's in physics, quantum physics, or theory of relativity in terms of cosmology. These are, a small group of people just hit on something and it proliferates, and that makes sense because it's just compelling. It reveals so much, opens so much avenues, and it's the same with people like Alan Turing and John von Neumann. I mean, so that has nothing to do with dogmatism. It just convinces everybody. And when we had, and nobody's forced. I mean, we had that moment, that feeling of the early 90s where everybody was electrified and eager to learn and to participate. And it also quickly becomes, everybody's property. And you have a lot of creative figures. Very, very quickly, already in the early 30s, all the fantastic Italian modernists, and then you have all the, you have Alto, and it just keeps going. Paul Rudolph and a lot. So there's nothing dogmatic about it, but I think that we should expect this because it isn't arbitrary. If you think it makes no difference whether you invest in an architectural repertoire which is basically 80 years old, something which is 50 years old, and they could be opposing in their methodology and spirit and what they imply for the city, as if that doesn't matter. Something is fundamentally amiss in the meta-conception that there is a path forward. These things are not equal. One thing is more fruitful and productive than the other. It's a little more subtle to tease out, right? You need theoretical argument as well as examples to to appraise and tease out that there's a superiority in a particular approach, because these things are very, very complex. It's not a trivial discussion, but we should aim at finding out which of these methodologies and are
Patrick,
more
it's just not true.
winning methodologies.
It's just not true that proliferation is a proof. That the proliferation of something is a
I'm
proof
not saying
of
it's
its
a proof, but
fitness, or there are things that proliferate that shouldn't. So
yes,
yeah,
well,
imagine if everyone did crack cocaine. I'm told that crack cocaine
I
is
accept that.
seriously amazing.
I accept that.
And that you
But I think
feel good like
what
right
is
away.
the proof is there is never a final proof,
Okay.
because the world is all. But what we need to look at is the prosperity which comes along with it. So if you look at the 20th century modernization and what modernism delivered in the modern city, and how this ties in with industrial society, mass mechanical reproduction, and the prosperity levels and degrees of freedom, material freedom, which have been delivered by 1960 compared to 1910. That's a massive shift forward. Okay, the attribution back to particular modernism and its contribution to this can never be conclusive. You don't have the counterfactual. But you can imagine, would it have been possible to have the industrial society of 1965 with a neoclassical stone symmetry and proportion kind of block architecture, a Chicago, a Manhattan, whatever. And you think, well, not so credible, right? But the counterfactual is difficult, and the attribution, how much of this is due to architecture. But so, yeah.
No, you make a good point. I think Gregory should say something.
Okay, so thank you. Hello. I feel like one of the things, there's an elephant in the room that we haven't been talking about, which I'd love to hear you talk about a little bit, which is, the elephant to me is the computer. And it's the ability for us to be able to do these massive calculations and iterations, and be able to explore possibilities that we couldn't imagine before, that we couldn't, and very importantly, analyze before, right? And be able to prove that we could build it and understand, right? So I hear this discussion about parametric urbanism, and what I hear and love about it is that it is very natural. It's a very natural process. It responds to all of these other forces. It's a highly intelligent process, not something that I could imagine this person who is an urban planner is capable of developing all of this as one person. But in fact, I imagine a system almost like our combinations of using Rhino to Grasshopper to something like Millipede that you described, which can actually help us visualize many, many different iterations of a design and solutions that we couldn't even imagine, but we can make rules, right? Parametric design is about making rules, about making, saying there's certain priorities, be it economic or climate, right, program. But if there was, can we use the computer to help us generate these kinds of urban landscapes through a set of priorities and scripts and algorithms that help us to visualize these things, and then rather than becoming these authors, we're not authors anymore, but instead we're editors. Right? Is that what you see parametric design going on?
I think, Greg, I think you nailed a very, very important point. I would still think there's a role of authorship. Of course, it's at the same time it's distributed and there are multiple authorships and influentials, there's intertextuality, but we still are authors as points of references and making propositions and taking responsibility for propositions. But the authorship is different than it used to be.
I mean, I think the proliferation is in the software. You can't create a software now that's not parametric. Every software is parametric. That's the way it's going. So I think naturally, if you're working at a computer,
you outsource a lot of the subsidiary decisions, but you still are a decision maker in which set of criteria you bring to bear, how you translate these inputs into propositional outputs.
But in a way, like computational is such a like a neutral term. It's not. It doesn't necessarily mean if something come out of computer is fantastic, right? You can compute this fantastic shape there, or you can compute a kind of Palladius out of it. So computational doesn't take an argument. It is just a machine.
But it's what I think what
But
it's a precondition of our aspirations, and without the computer we couldn't have those aspirations. And when somebody can use a computer to do Palladio, but it's in a sense a waste of the computer.
No, but it's in the end, it's what's the input, right? If your input has nothing, say in curve, it will end up with boxes.
You can do, yeah, of course. But you can mess up royally with your algorithms and selecting the inputs and doing irrational things.
And your buildings.
Of course.
You can mess up royally with your
buildings. You can massively and royally mess up and misdirect the efforts. That's clear. But you have, on the positive side, the potential to do something massively intricate and high performance, which was outside of your scope. And if somebody is aspiring using the computer to do Palladio, good for him, but he didn't need the computer for that. We need the computer for the things we aspire to. And there are more intricate and sophisticated...
No, see, for me, that's the difference. If you could go back in time and do time-lapse photography of the growth of a city, right? I mean, a picture a day. So you could watch like Paris go from a village to Paris in 20 minutes. It would look pretty damn organic. It would look really like growth. It would look, you would think that you were looking at an agent-based automaton, biological thingamajig. Yeah, it would be like parametric.
What about a suburb in Lubbock?
Same. I do believe it would look the same. And I think you would feel like you were looking at an inner-driven, striving, opportunistic, amoeba kind of thing. But when you zoomed in, you would find planning rules and all kinds of stuff that didn't look terribly parametric. And so I feel like when I hear your model, the parametric future of architecture, I see a much greater time scale. And I think you, to my impression now, is you want it now. The only time frame you mentioned is 20 years. But maybe 20 years, maybe you need to think 200 years.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
That's too far. No.
Yeah, maybe 2000.
No.
Sorry, Patrick. But it's going to take 200 years before we get a material strong enough to stand up.
Well, this is 100 years today.
So, anybody else, please? Yep.
My question is that how do you see individuality in parametric design? Because my understanding is that people's perception of architecture on space is varied from one to another. And how does that be able to become a control or a parameter in the parametric design?
Very good point. I mean, I'm trying to account for this. So, we live in a complex society where we have, modernism was a kind of one-fit-all. Everybody 9 to 5, everybody cornflakes, Volkswagen and packaged holiday, incredible. And now we're having a much more differentiated life processes, lifestyles, the way we tie in the work environment. We're also more changeful in our careers. So we need to take into account that buildings have multiple audience, multiple perspectives, and cultural sensitivities to be accounted for. So yeah, we have to try to take into account to some extent how buildings appear for particular audience at particular times and build that into a loop of reflection. Trying to do that. I call it the phenomenological project, which is about psychology of perception, the idea of how do you grasp and read the space, and with what preconception and priming sensibilities, you come to do that. That's a loop of reflection one can take in. You can't individualize to everybody, that's impossible, but you could certainly look at more than one stereotype audience confronting your building. There are different user groups with different agendas who look for different things and different affiliations, and you can take that into account.
That's a question that Graham had for you in his review of the TARC.
Okay.
Did you read that?
I forgot.
Okay, well, anyway, he's curious about when you define society, what is the boundary of society? Is it multiple societies? Who are you designing for? Are you designing for the client? Is that your society? Is it the community? Is it
I
the...
think Patrik said it's global society now.
It's world society, but the world society is differentiated, is erogenous. What I don't believe is, for instance, we say, this is a space for everybody. This is Sunday speech. That's why I've been also talking about the privatization of public space, because if we do it public, in a democratic society, we have to say every public space is a space for everybody, full stop and literally, and I think it's unrealistic and unviable and makes everything generic and sterile, and it's a nobody space. So I've been critical for that. So I'm highly sensitive to the fact that we live in a world society where we share certain competencies, and we should all expect that there's a minimal shared set of competencies where we, for instance, not racist, where we sort of open and expecting cultural differences and be reflective and we don't get into fist fights. These are competencies we expect. But then there's a whole series of differentiations of different subcultures where we have to learn the particular subsidiary subcultures which might be quite different, and architecture through the client's initiative would be attuned to those. So the client comes in and says, hey, I can see this hotel addresses a certain segment, maybe a certain cosmopolitan, designer-like kind of character he has in mind, because I think when we architecture for me is all about ordering social processes and enhancing the capacity, the encounter potentials between people who are relevant for each other. And there's only a small subset within an overall population which is truly relevant for you. That's why you select to dress in a particular way, you go to particular bars, you go to particular places, because the chance of meeting somebody who is relevant to you is enhanced, and it's not very kind of randomly distributed. So I think that's for me very important.
The question for me is, I agree with that. It's just like how much is form related to this? I mean, if we talk about social relations, it doesn't matter which kind of built environment we are in, right?
It does. And that's when we come to Michael.
The other thing is a really good question for whom are we building? Like if we are taking orders from the client, who's actually following the order of the market? So where do you draw the kind of the line between different systems? Like from where to where is our task?
I think Patrik thinks he has the answers.
Yeah, I know.
I think Patrik doesn't have the answers. And I think that there are significant gaps.
Do you have the answers?
No.
But
I do have, but he has them.
Yes, I took all
Are you seeking those answers?
Very, very, very strongly, yes.
What holds you back? Why haven't you cracked through?
Because I'm too busy in this room talking to you. No,
I have a question for you.
Yes.
Very serious, because it ties in what Lei was just talking about. Does form matter when it comes to, for me, to facilitate relevant encounters?
Yes.
And this kind of sorting capacity of the built environment. For me, the built environment is sorting and distributing interaction potentials, and not every interaction is for everybody. I'm starting to talk about a semiological system, a semiological project, and when I read cyberspace, and by the way, for me, parametrism is not only architecture and urban design, interior design.
It's everything.
It's also fashion and graphic design and
I think you should
virtual environment design.
You should add cuisine.
Okay. No, I'm getting it somewhere.
Yeah.
So when you came out, when the internet started, there was this kind of thrill and expectation that architects have a role in evolving and designing the virtual space of encounter.
I really thought so.
it became more of a graphic designer job. I believe that too, but what I took from it, I run with it, I created a project called the Virtual College. So I said the internet facilitated interaction of virtual students, online studying, inscribing in an institution in a college, and finding the various offerings, texts, seminars, videos, and so on, would be a kind of cyberspace design condition. Now, what was interesting for me there was, and I still believe that potentially it might be coming through VR now more, but what it hit me with the way you talked about, basically, because this is clearly a semiological project, where you decided to show that you could formally encode the different distinctions, and you have also the navigation space, the destination space, and you distinguished intrinsic versus extrinsic registers of encoding, so that the positionality of an element could infer a meaning from it, or a morphological element, a color element. So this is very influential. So I've been running with this and I'm working this ever since. So I've developed a semiological project. I wonder if you had worked on this, understood this, where you would buy into the semiological project in architecture, because what applies to cyberspace equally applies to spaces in the real world. The real campus and the virtual campus, our task is the semiological project.
I like that, yeah.
No, there's
Bingo.
Go ahead.
there's a key difference between the virtual space and the built environment. It's the rate of changing, right? You build something, it's not going to change for the next 100 years, and the virtual space can keep adapting. So if you're really arguing for your sociological kind of theory, you should actually go to the virtual space, because that's adapting.
Well,
that's simultaneous adapting.
It is faster. It's true. It's much more versatile and rapid.
It's much
but it's still, in terms of the city, could change within 10 years and within 20 years. These are meaningful time schedules.
Because we just discussed the time span.
It's true. Your point is true, but it doesn't invalidate the semiological
I could just tell you it's a lot slower than I hoped it would be.
Yeah.
In the 90s was theorizing this was thrilling, and it was MIT Press's bestseller for like 5 years. I even made some money on that.
We're bringing.
Did you work on this?
Yeah. I was like, Mr. Cyberspace, and I put it away. And that's true.
Why? It's true.
It wasn't happening fast enough. The computing power wasn't there. We still would need gigabytes per second internet to feed it.
It's time again, Michael.
Well,
Just connected to TAG today. We have a supercomputer. It's
And you know what? Fascinating. Now I imagine that the real spaces become interfaces into the virtual as well.
but I don't want to talk about.
And these
you.
are all.
We're here to talk about you.
No, but what's important for me is what brought it home to me. These are communication spaces, and design is communication design, and it's systems of signification. And I translate this back into the real city and say, hey, the architect's job is to conceive of the real built environment as in terms of communication design, in terms of the space of semiological encoding, of gathering and structuring interaction potentials, and through this signaling. That's why I was answering your question, the Lei's question, in terms of what the formal languages matter. They matter in terms of guiding
But we can't get.
socialized actors.
I have to let.
They become a
I
text.
have to let you speak, because otherwise it's going to be a dialogue.
No, but I'm just thinking like the ultimate semiology kind of project would be everybody wearing Google Glass with all this information, all these changes, connection, communication, walking in boxes, right? Like why would you? Because then you treat the built environment as a huge like kind of a projecting machine. So why would?
I accept.
I remember getting exactly that thing, and my
You
answer.
said that, yeah.
And I had a lot of people saying that augmented reality is the way to go. No, you don't put a thing on your face,
VR.
but you project stuff in your glasses and in the world on walls that know you're there and so forth. So that's a very interesting sort of dialogue.
Yeah,
Let me step back.
My own work
I
is.
accept that.
My
I
own
want
work is
to
going.
step back to something you said, which is that that you create a parametric city, you're ordering different groups of society, and you don't want a free-for-all, and I understand that, I agree with that. My question is, does that then limit the emergent interactions of people that we're exposed to meet that might produce a new condition? Like you think of if you watch a movie, the only interesting movies are ones where you don't expect the interactions of people. When you put two groups together and then something else develops from that interaction. Would this kind of
Occasionally,
approach,
I would say that no. I would say
Yeah.
90%.
would it stop
Kind of-
communication from different subgroups?
90% maybe selected, pre-selected, but it should be
Yeah.
100%. So there's this kind of element of random encounters. But random encounters will be most probably just not get you far and would disturb you.
But the two or three that do could
But I
change
know
the world.
that so yeah, that's why you should have them in a mix.
Yeah.
Okay, so
But not all the time, everywhere.
so believe it or not, since
I'm really fascinated by the connection of architecture to this virtual world that we're living and growing up in, and particularly how the children of today, as they grow up with these minds that grow around living in the virtual world, how their reading of the physical environment will change, and how perhaps parametric software can help actually communicate to that generation that is growing up and will be, I don't think the way that we interact with the virtual world is going to become less virtual, it's only going to become more virtual. And so do you see parametric software as a way to bridge that gap between virtual and physical worlds? Because I think that's where we're coming at two different sort of polarized living conditions, I guess, virtual and physical. So do you see that link happening?
Yeah, I think it's happening more and more. I mean, at the moment, this idea of Google Glasses and it projects a piece of writing and tells you what is what, yes, would substitute a lot of what I call the semiological system. First of all, we don't have those. Second, though, I find that and we have this, we can look up where you are and you get, use the Google map and you get notifications, but this is a very small interface. And I still have to read discrete letters, and I would have to pay attention to reading. Now, I believe that in real space, we use all our senses, 360-degree in layers, and the bandwidth of processing is much higher because I have a vestibular sense where I know whether I'm moving up, down, sideways. I have a sense of the lighting conditions. I get the gestalt feel of a space where I'm in, which isn't a piece of writing, which is very nuanced, a mix of many different things, which I perceive is in the mix here. So I think we have much more sensuous and information processing capacity with all our senses in real space than what can be translated back into a label which appears at my Google Glass. So I think there is a partial substitution potential, but I think we're very far off of having that, and I think we're not, it's not a full substitute. So I still believe that we process an enormous amount of information intuitively in a space. Also when I see face to face, who is twitching, what are you wearing, what is your eyes glazing over? Is that also, I can't read all this. I have to read the whole text, it will take me an hour. What I pick up here, that nervous twitch in the back, this kind of, is somebody passing by. So that bandwidth is what I want to bring home. And I'm talking about information-rich environments and more strategic things. So we perceive a lot of things, but a lot of the architecture is relatively mute. It's polluted. It doesn't tell me the nuance where I am, what's going on, and that's what I want to build much more richly. That things, the materiality of this table, the climatic values of that space, the friction on the floor, all these things become registered in a text.
Do you see the work of Zaha the architect?
And this is something which my project, this is hooked onto parametricism. I call it agent-based parametric semiology, but it's not something that's my original contribution, let's say, to the contemporary condition, and not something which is encompassed in parametricism as such as it exists as a collective movement as of now. The same is what is in this book. It goes, let's say, beyond parametricism. It's this whole idea of society as communication process and how architecture through the information rich environment becomes part of a dense communication process.
I just want to say one thing. So you're talking about the bandwidth and the amount of information you can take in. But I also wonder if the way we interact with the virtual world from the beginning, from being a toddler and up, if that starts to change the way that we pick up on patterns in our physical environment. So it's not about having the screens in front of you and then the physical environment in the back. It's actually about having parametric buildings that reflect an order which you're very comfortable understanding.
I believe that when Michael started writing, he thought that the internet will use architectural tropes and navigation principles. I think what you're pointing is that there was something inverse will happen, and it starts to happen already. That you will maybe have certain icons and emoticons and so on, that which we'll use as a graphic overlay into real spaces. There could be an influence there.
Actually,
this is up to you as an architect maybe to see the potential of this. If we're all used to navigating Facebook pages and
Actually, Patrik, my major disappointment was, and advocacy in cyberspace, was that cyberspace or virtual reality would not use architectural tropes.
No.
That actually be a place for certain magics to happen that the real world cannot perform. Like doorways that if you keep going clockwise, you go to new places. If you go anti-clockwise, you unwind through different spaces. There are things you can do in virtual worlds which buildings simply cannot do. And they are spatial navigational tropes that buildings can't handle, but humans might. We might be able, and kids might. I think the environment that most kills brain cells is the average American high school. I think if you grow up in a suburban environment and go to a suburban high school, it's going to be very hard for you to see architecture.
I mean, we've been just the Google Culture Lab, right, in Paris, so.
Yeah.
And I think it's coming a little bit your way in terms of the way they present, let's say, machine learning, clustering of images as a kind of topography with clustering, with density.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're using space.
Right. And I think we're going to find new limits to what we can handle spatially.
Yeah. I wonder, in the direction of the architects, do you find that your buildings will be more articulated in the future as you move forward, or with this sort of layer of information?
With that articulation and technology moving as quickly as it is, buildings become more and more like closed loops, but yet everything's advancing so quickly that these buildings don't have this ability to flex and change to accommodate these new changes in societies or new building styles or something. Like, how important to you is it that buildings are able to flex and breathe and grow over time?
I mean, I'll say two things. First of all, there's some aspects of the new contemporary conditions which are relatively stable across the decades. So this idea of inter-awareness of spaces. So in buildings now, if you look at, even Ram was talking about it, bigness, deep buildings where you have many relationships, so you open the sections, where you have porosity and many things into view. Independent of what the particulars are now, how this distribute, that's a good idea, which will also be robust enough to sustain multiple reuses, because each of the contemporary institutions, different corporation, a non-profit, a library, will all want to have that new level of porosity, that variation, or that in an urbanism like this, that you, instead of having 100 equal blocks, that you have a whole range of sizes and densities. That's a good idea, even if who is sorting themselves into this, the particulars will change. So there are certain things, parametricism, there's a robustness across time. At the same time, there's a robustness of substitution of buildings, and because it's not like a Baroque coherent symmetry proportion, coherent detailed thing where if you replace one element with another, it always stands out as a saw point, a breakdown of order, whereas these orders we're talking about, they're quite robust, they're always incomplete, can evolve and emerge, and there's multiple ways of completing them. So there's robustness there, and there's also on top of this, there would be, we're looking at responsive environments, layers of ephemerality or layers of degrees of transience where your partitioning system could be substituted, lighting conditions, the furnishings are evolving maybe day per day, even daily or weekly. So we are catering for potentially that with literally physical transformations, but also with, let's say, key new organizational registers and qualities which have that robustness I was talking about. Which means that I believe that is viable and can sustain and evolve change and absorb change, and we don't have to think of flexibility only be delivered through some kind of empty Gaussian boxes, which at any point could be anything. I think that's not the right way to deliver flexibility, because that's at any point in the condition would be disorienting.
It's wrong for everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Patrick, could I shift your imagination to the world of construction for a moment? And I'm thinking about how so much that we build is driven by the way that we harvest materials and build the pieces that we use to make buildings. For example, like, we cut stone blades into straight pieces and we extrude steel using a system that creates one uniform shape, right? And if you could imagine a completely new way of making materials, or maybe there's something on the horizon that we could do, what way of making materials would best support parametricism? Would it be cutting and chopping and gluing and sticking, or what do you see as the...
A lot of people, I mean, what would be natural would be materials which are themselves continuously differentiated. So you do literally material engineering from the bottom up, which you might deliver through 3D printing. So where instead of being a homogeneous material, like an extruded steel beam, you not only vary the form, but you also vary the density of the material, the porosity, directionality of the fibers
like
at this
bones.
end and a more. So it will be the dream of that material project would be that you have not only the outer form, but the internal structuration, like a bone. In nature you find that. If you take a bone, it's not only an outer form which changes and thins out and swells, but the internal structuration is migrating and varying. And now imagine even that not only that, but also the materiality would shift from a kind of mixture of metal with carbon fiber into pure carbon fiber. So this would be a dream of that, and people are working on this. This is kind of micro nanotechnology and so on.
I actually have a question for Kory. Because I know you're not like such a strong believer of triple O, right? Am I correct? Yeah. And then I hear like already a couple students quoting about discreteness.
Yeah.
So I just want to hear your argument, also facing like this room, kind of, correct me if I'm wrong, like it's more like formal exercises. Like. So I just want to hear your argument about like what's the take? What's your take on this?
On this?
Could you repeat the question a little bit? Because believe it or not, I could not hear what you said. Because it was going around the room before it came back to me. Just repeat the question for me.
The question? The question is, what is my take on triple O, and I guess its relationship to architecture, form, and maybe how it diverges.
And also the discreteness, parametricism.
Discreteness. I mean, for
aesthetic
me,
activism. Like I'm a little bit like you're just curious, like looking at all these works, like
Yeah,
what's your
yeah.
take on this?
I mean, for me, I resist any approach, and I try to accommodate a lot. I wrote an essay for Sucker Punch when they did the book. I think you wrote something about architecture on multiple genre. I see it much more like cinema, where one can operate in different genre and even mixed genre, like the Western, kung fu movie. And so for me, I like to absorb all of these things. So when I teach a studio, I think there's some tendency toward one or another, but I think it's not exclusive of any other idea. And with Graham, I thought was interesting. What I agree with is that philosophy is very different than architectural theory for me. Philosophy, Triple O, all of these have to wrap a much broader set of issues than architectural theory, which is a much more isolated set. So that's why I don't find them at odds with each other. I think parametricism does have some philosophical implications at a larger scale, but it's much more contained within a smaller boundary. So all of the things that Triple O rejects about parametricism are falling outside the envelope of parametricism as an architectural theory. These are ideas of like withdrawn, properties of objects. Doesn't matter necessarily for architecture. So it's not really a conducive approach if one's going to use it and try to apply it to architecture. So I think that's my general approach. I do think there's a lot of overlap in all theory in architecture. I think ultimately we have to implement these, and that's why I mentioned Ian Bogus, because he's someone who's trying to implement philosophy as an approach to making. So everything that I try to do is trying to instrumentalize the ideas into actual physical artifacts. And I don't know, so I think that sheds a lot of OO away, actually. But I do find a lot of similarities. Like a lot of the, Graham talks about ruination, how one tests the qualities of an object, the boundaries of an object, whether it's an object or not, through ruination. So he talks about jokes, and he says, you present a joke, and you start to test it for its weaknesses, and if you can find a weakness, it falls apart as an object. I find the same thing with parametricism would support that, because it creates a coherent system, it creates an order within architecture, and if you're able to break that order, then it falls apart as an architectural figure. And so for me, that's like a strong overlap between the two. I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Patrick, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
We've talked about parametricism mostly in the context of architecture, but you brought up interior design, product design as kind of being a part of parametricism. So how do you see parametricism in terms of how it structures relationships among these disciplines? And I think this will be helpful for students, some of them are kind of crossing over into multiple fields, and some of them are kind of working within in kind of individual disciplines. Do you see a sort of parametric interior design operating autonomously from architecture potentially, or is it really this kind of total work of architecture paradigm? How do you see that?
Well, I see it very much as integrated. But I also realize I don't expect it to be single author all the way through. Although we aspire this in our work to deliver the coherence, because in the current state of architecture, if we not do the interior, we might end up with a postmodern or neoclassical or imperial kind of interior. So we have to, but ultimately, in a more idealized future scenario, there could be different authors, interior design company coming in, but it would be expected to be congenial. We, in our discourse, would criticize each other if it wasn't. And so for me, there's a total continuity of all the design disciplines, all the way from urban design down to fashion design, graphic design, because I'm saying the scope of our field, which is now all the design disciplines, is literally that every act of communication or interaction is mediated by a designer's framing, offering. So we're sitting here now in a room which was designed by architects, which was furnished to structure the interaction. We all dressed up in a particular way for the event to signal that we're kind of down to earth and we're not coming here to date somebody, but to interact. And that frames this interaction. All the designers, the fashion we select, the room we're sitting in, but also when we then go to Facebook, there's a graphic designer who's designing that interface for us. And we're going online, the website. A book, it's not only the writer, it's a piece of graphic design. So there's not a single communication which isn't within our scope. And that's, I find, fascinating. It's across all the design disciplines. And for me, this is in all these artifacts. So I'm saying we are universal and exclusive competency with respect to the design of everything which envelopes us and we encounter in the world. Because we're living in totally designed environments, includes landscape design, urbanism, and so on. Everything we touch, most of the things we're encountering are still Bauhaus, by the way. And so, but we are in charge of a particular aspect of this, because engineers are involved in all of this too. To make sure this doesn't crash on top of this, that we're not freezing, that it's not burning some enormous amount of energy when we do this. And there's also under the hood design going to Facebook. This is engineering, but now I'm seeing what is our particular core competency in this respect is that we are in charge, in fact, of the communicative capacity and the social functionality through communicative capacity of everything we encounter. That's the way I define our discipline. And our discipline now is the totality of the design disciplines, and that's where we as the architects, and Zara always had the intuition, many architects had the intuition. When Mies van der Rohe is going from urbanism to architecture to furniture design, they also were designing cars. Look at the Bauhaus. They have fashion design, fabrics, cutlery, the paraphernalia of everything, graphic. And that's my spirit too. That's also design architects. Of course, you can relatively specialize and become more of an interior designer. We have an interior design department, but the fundamental discursive categories relating form to function, grasping social functionality as our and understanding this as communication would go through all the design disciplines. And that's my take and sense. So it totally makes sense to have that integrated into school and be a unified discourse.
So, in this sense, do you believe the only way to create a masterpiece is design down to the carbon thread? Or, and if that's so, do you believe that parametric software will allow us to have more and more masterpieces, something that we couldn't really achieve?
Okay, I don't believe that it's the precondition of a masterpiece. I would aspire to this, but most probably the most sophisticated high performance offering to society, and for me that's in the end, how does it make a vital life process happening? It's not a masterpiece in some kind of connoisseur appreciation. Would also believe that multiple specialists or parametricists coming together in that artifact. I could also imagine it to be a firm like us. It's not going to be a single person. There are multiple teams, and we're going to hand it from department to department. They're a different individual, but it could also be separate firms who would bring that, but that these things have to do with each other, that the selection of material, coloration, ambience has some kind of continuity and reference and resonance with the exterior envelope design, with the spatial dispositions, that these things connect up in some kind of working together, that's for sure, but it can also be delivered by multiple authors coming together. And the same goes with the city. And with the city it falls down. I don't need to, Oscar Niemeyer designed the totality of Brasilia. That's possible in modernism to some extent. But the contemporary city of postmodernism is infinitely more complex and rich. Forget it. So that must become that bottom-up, multi-author creation where things tie in unpredictable ways, which is beyond anybody individual's comprehension. But that doesn't matter. That still is something which is happening. It's kind of collective intelligence.
But in that sense, you get a masterpiece of that group.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that.
And then it makes it possible for more and more groups to have these masterpieces. And in that sense, it almost becomes more like the virtual world, the sense that you can enter a world that's completely designed by the same idea.
I agree with that. And look, in 1927, It was the Bauhaus was that kind of cutting edge, and there have been
Now
many
it's happening.
contributors to the
Now we have a bunch of questions. I saw like 4 hands.
Yeah. My question is about articulation. I know I've read some of your articles on surface patterning and how that correlates to various parameters of the project. But I was wondering, at a sort of more conceptual level, Zala has innovated graphically by creating using gradients as forming spaces. But the question is, how do you define the edge in that case, or how is a boundary defined, and where do you put the door? That's my question. How you mediate between
Well, then there would be not the door. Maybe there are multiple thresholds, or it's just a pure gradient, but it could also be a gradient where there's multiple boundaries radiating outwards. I mean, you put your finger on something that's very profound. Something like the gradient as a design opportunity and an organizational trope is shockingly new and radically opened up a whole new universe of creation, which simply wasn't there. These are the moments where history is made in architecture, and there's a few of those. And the gradient was certainly one of them. And incredibly empowering, and now we have it at urbanism and in interiors, and it's just that you don't know where to put the door shows how radical this proposition is. But you still can structure social processes.
Do we have some? Yeah.
So, specifically, like within parametricism, at our level and our approach to parametricism, how do you ensure that the output of parametricism, or every aspect of the output of parametricism has genuine meaning? In the sense that I feel like when we're designing from a contemporary design standpoint, like we can sit and critique every aspect of it and justify meaning behind it, versus with parametricism, I feel as though that the output sometimes we assume that there are assumptions that can be made. So there are certain parts that do have genuine meaning, and then the excess is kind of fulfilled by assumption. So how do you ensure that the output of parametricism does have 100% genuine meaning?
You can never ensure that. But so it's an infinite project, and it's also the beauty of it that you confront yourself with a process, and you have some reasons to set some parameters in some ways, and then there's other aspects which you just encounter, and they're resultants of this, and you can then think it through more, and think through what capacities it have, and given a post-rationalized rationale, when you then add something to it, which then gives meaning retrospectively, you can always try to do that, or you vary it and have another go to see what that will do. It's an infinite project. It's also that these things relate to things in the vicinity or to things further away. There's a tower in the distance, maybe that imprints. These are infinite projects. This never complete, never conclusive, but what is beautiful about it that the heuristics of this would always allow you, if you spend another 3 days on it, think it through another week, with these principles, you can refine it further, let it resonate with more, appraise more meaning in it. And that means you can always progress, but then again you run out of time, you cut off, and then you're vulnerable to criticism. Hey, you could have done this and this and this and this, you can't explain. Fair enough, you can't explain. It's always excessive, let's agree with the triple O kind of insight. It always exceeds and excessive and remains unexplained in many of its aspects. But what I'm only looking for comparatively, this project, the way you evolved it and developed it, and 3 weeks later, compared to what you had, it has more capacities, more meanings, you know more what's going on, and you make decision to facilitate what you wanted to go on more, and that's good enough. It's always a relative, it's always a comparative.
I think you could argue
it's never an absolute.
I think you could argue that in a parametric system, it's a range between 2 limits, so it's a differentiated system. As long as you understand what that overall idea is, every instantiation of it is just a condition of its larger whole. So, you know, if in a differentiated system, every piece might be slightly different, but as long as you understand, Levi Bryant calls it the virtual proper being, as long as you understand that genesis of it and have meaning to there, then that meaning can be applied to each of the subsets. I think that would be an argument they would make.
Can you tell me about the significance of the concept of estrangement in Triple O?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the concept.
And how this ties in with architecture?
I think you could argue that, I mean, it's similar to what you're saying with capacities. I think every time you engage an object, there's an estrangement. You'll never know fully the intrinsic qualities of the conditions within it. And nor do I think you want to. I mean, I think that's the opposite of modernism. When you talk about a box, it's given to you. It's an object that's fully understood. And Graham would argue that the white box, he said this in our symposium, is the absolute last thing one would want in a AAA project. So he would agree in that. But yeah, I mean, I think that it just assumes and understands that there's constantly a set of relationships that are. It's similar to Deleuze's theory of assemblage, where you're always entering and exiting the assemblage, and that there's no definite condition for it. Objects are constantly living and dying. There's not the object, and that lasts forever. If I take a part of that object, if I take my heart out of my assemblage, then the whole body fails. So I do think that, you know, estrangement is that I don't know how my heart's functioning inside of me, but it's part of this assemblage. I'm an object because of the grouping that's happening right now, but as soon as that's removed, this object dies, another object forms. Yeah.
Going off of estrangement, I think that parametricism makes estrangement much more easy to achieve, much more tangible for designers and architects. And earlier you mentioned like how it's good to have moments of that in a city, but the whole city shouldn't be structured in that way. How do you see that as like a danger, and parametricism as a danger to architecture and the integrity of like buildings within the city? Because if the more start to become these parametric objects or things, does it diminish architecture as a whole? Does that make sense?
I'm not sure if you catch your. Can you try again?
Okay. So is parametricism making it easier to achieve these forms or these different moves within architecture itself, and technology advancing with that, and architecture moving in that same direction? Do you think that all of this combined is going to actually diminish the power of the building within the city?
The building is an icon?
Exactly.
Yes, because but if there was an institution or place like a fulcrum of importance, which everybody should be aware of, and it really pops out like kind of a discontinuity and draws an enormous amount of attention, because that's what you get potentially if you with an iconic piece. If it is justified, yes, we would allow for that discontinuity at that point. But which institution in contemporary society deserves that level of prominence? I wonder. But that there are differences of prominence, of conspicuity, of iconicity in the kind of texture, I also accept. And that it might also be temporary and also from different perspectives differentially. That's what I'm looking at as well. So some kind of, now we see it, now we don't, figuration of figures in particular perspectives becoming prominent and conspicuous under certain conditions is of interest to me, but I don't believe that, yes, so this approach of parametricism in a sense doesn't expect a singular building to have an enormously disruptive prominence. Because I don't think there's an institution which deserves that in the city. So that becomes an advantage of parametricism. Could you still pull it off? Yeah, because if you make this kind of beautiful continuous texture, you could still be disruptive about it. And I've been sometimes asking, are you trying to smooth over everything? Aren't you allowing for disruption, for discontinuities? I said, well, not necessarily that I disallow for this, but where would it merit? And then if I start, would I want to do that once 5 times, 25 times, and if I do it 50 times, then collapse the whole thing back again. So that's something of calibration. And most probably, a total discontinuity is rarely merited because it cuts off a lot of relations and posits a particular intervention as a kind of radical break which draws all attention upon itself. And I don't know who merits that. It's contemporary condition.
Wouldn't you say that a given parametric, formally different building kind of does that in the environment that we find ourselves in now?
Yes, and that's the big problem. And that's why we've been so misunderstood. But how do we start? How do we go about it? So we've been misinterpreted as craving for that spectacle, that unique, other idiosyncratic things, this kind of signature piece, as this we were all about. We're not. And Zaha always thought about it. The cities is filling the cities with texture, with rhythms, with pulsation. It's the same with the modernists. When the Seagram's building emerged in the 50s, it was like a shock of otherness. Now look back, it has remade the city in its image. That's what we aspire to. So there's a false temporary, and it's difficult to navigate. And we're trying to embed, to camouflage in these projects, but they are different because there's a different set of principles. They're inordinately conspicuous beyond what they should be in the final analysis. It's a dilemma.
But isn't that the power of that initial shock to hold interest and then maintain it, and then as things kind of build around it and become more sewn into the urban fabric, it's sort of like the power is with that shock, and then it starts to become.
There is that, and let's put it this way. I mean, it's difficult to resist, and the attention you get over that, and so on. And it's these projects are manifesto projects that point beyond themselves, they point into the future, and all that is true. But the final destiny isn't that. Final destiny is more of a kind of pulsating texture and the subfusion of this, unless they again merit a particular prominence. And oftentimes what we've been initially asked to do are public buildings, major buildings. The National Museum of Contemporary Art and Architecture of the 21st century. This deserves a certain degree of conspicuity, which is bigger than its size, for instance. But when it comes to now, we're doing complexes, urban mixed-use complexes, business districts, towers and so on. They don't necessarily deserve that. And so there's a temporary misalignment of final intentions and interim outcomes. It's a bit like the Mies Seagram's building in 1950.
So my question goes back to the point that Prashant raised about doors. Now, with Kory's kind of contribution of defining like parametricism as the range between two limits, or what Prashant mentioned about a gradient, doors may not be relevant within the building because conceptually they don't fit within that framework, or you create within your framework a situation where they don't really need to exist. But my question is, possibly close to the discussion between Benedikt and yourself, is there a value between that 0 to 1 state that a door kind of needs, rather than the defining, I guess, enclosure or limits to the space by that range within 2 limits?
Look, I'm not excluding doors altogether, but I think a spatial condition, which was already in some parts of modernism overcome, where you have basically, you dissect the city into discrete buildings, and then that building is dissected into discrete rooms, and the navigation is very easy. Basically it's a nesting of domains, and each time is crystal clear whether you've now moved to another door and where you are. Until you move out, that's only one thing, and you get it in a second. That's the triviality of these box architectures. It's very unambiguous, very clear, but it's also there's a poverty of information and relation. You're only doing one thing at a time. And that's the limitations of that. And then you literally have to decide, am I joining that seminar and I'm now sitting there for 3 hours and I'm closing, I can't leave. And that's a bit limiting. Whereas, or am I joining that meeting, am I joining that gathering? And if it's more of an open, fluid Bürolandschaft with degrees of participation and proximity, you can maybe be between several and participate in some, you pull a bit closer, pull a bit away. And it's more fluid and varied. You get in these 3 hours, you get many more interactions. And you had a bit of a trial and error, and you found the gathering interaction you wanted. You have a more productive and fruitful afternoon made possible in that kind of building, rather than the kind of building which is second in rooms, where you literally have to also, you have to come on the spot, because later on if you knock the door and you come in, you disrupt, you disturb. So doors, yeah, I mean doors are not totally excluded, but they're devices of a bygone era.
So maybe, how are we doing? Should we wrap it up? We're supposed to be finishing.
Do you want me to speak in favor of doors?
Because I like doors. Having something divided from you for a moment and then finding out possibly what's in that room and richness contained that you didn't see before.
I think doors are an extreme case of relationships between spaces or rooms. I think there's something that I, in my theory, called membranes. Membranes are like very, very delicate membranes that tie themselves to certain conditions in architecture, where you can tell that what's going on here is different to what's going on there.
Yeah.
So I feel like the preservation of those membranes is essential to executing the network diagrams that you're interested in, and that we should explore, as I think you would say, the full range of them.
This is why I get excited when you say you're moving in a direction of more articulation, because I do think that's...
Because sometimes turning everything into a ramp and the interior of a building into Swiss cheese, so that everything is visible from everywhere, all like, okay. Is making things like a string of black boxes with doors on it, is that, like if that's an extremity,
but look,
that's probably not a good idea either. So I would like to think that a good architect has the range of those things open to them. I'm not sure if that's one parameter, dooredness, but things like permeability or membrane frequency or something like this, that there are ways to actually measure and control porosities that in a very theoretical way would take you all the way from a totally classical or Peso von Elrichhausen type of architecture all the way to a completely liquid architecture like by Marcus Novak or Greg Lynn or these guys, that it would be a wonderful discipline if we knew when to do which, and even better, how to make one building that moves from one condition to the other easily. The way Beethoven could go from like drama to tragedy in 3 bars. I mean, why can't we do that? So I think there are many pleasures in architecture, and opening a door is certainly one of them. And the proscenium of a 19th century theater, the division of audience world from theater world, what a fabulous membrane that is, and how we feel about transgressing it and so forth. These are some of the great, great pleasures of architecture. And I personally would not like to see them melted away. But nor would I want to see an architecture that consists solely of box after box after box.
Pleasures need to be productive, right?
No.
Because you could find pleasure in many different things.
Yeah.
So pleasure will not get away, but you better align what's fun for you with what's good for you.
Yeah.
And therefore we have to, and that's the way my theory of aesthetic sensibilities is this, that we always have them, we always navigate the world through them on the basis of what appeals and what repulses, but we also have the freedom to evolve our conditionings, and we should rather be drawn to things which are productive and make us prosper in can flourish, rather than being continuously drawn to things which are misguiding us and
I think we can
hampering our
I think we can find agreement.
And in terms of doors and thresholds, I mean, what I believe in is, yes, it doesn't have to be always continuously gradients. There will be thresholds, there will be difference installed. So that Swiss cheese, that sponge space is interesting. You could have intervisibility, yet, and porosity, yet the zones are quite different in the atmosphere and what they allocate in terms of the interaction situations. For me, the built environment is distributing situations. A situation for the intimate one-to-one, a situation for the seminar, a situation for an informative, formal meeting, a working life. So the society is just a hugely varied set of situations which we need to be sorted into and sort ourselves into actively. Because this is a seminar and at the same time as a night club or something. So, and it becomes productive in the seminar if we all understand that this seminar, and that's why it's located in the school, that's why it's structured in a certain way, that's why we dress up in a certain way. And then around the corners are other things. There's a foyer, the garden, there's the public space, and we need to go through all of this and we cooperate and integrate through all these different interactions and situations, and the architecture is distributing them and informing us about where is what, that we can participate in all of that. And for that we need difference. But I think the intervisibility is important because you need to find in your day, in your week, all these different situations which you need to enhance and participate in social life. So that would be the thing. Why I think the porosity and intervisibility is important, inter-awareness is important, not necessarily visibility. It could also be that a certain pattern on this wall tells you what's behind. There's this inference potential, a semiological information radiating through. It doesn't mean direct visibility, it means being informed about what's going on.
It just means knowing what's on the other side.
And knowing what's coming, what you expected, and that's for me the semiological project, which works a lot with visibility, but also with semiological encoding of what's going where and what's close to here and what you want to participate in. These things are varied and different and multiple, and yes, there could be gradients, but not necessarily. It's a exciting new potential, but I don't believe that everything is gradient. There's also a moment where you snap, you cross the threshold, and then as you step into that new space, new rules of interaction, engagement, and a new situation is defined. Differences that make a difference. So spatial, articulated difference indicate a new interaction situation. And that's for me the essence of a semiological project. And that's when I do crowd modeling, I have these crowds with a whole stack of activities and valencies of interaction, and as they cross onto that, from that marble surface onto that carpet in that lower ceiling with a different light, suddenly a switching behavioral stack, and they have a new mode of interaction. And everybody is crossing that. They're now put on the same page here, so that something meaningful and relevant comes in and they're not disturbing each other, having all different preconceptions. So it's defining these situations through architecture is key for me, and then trying to simulate that. And if you have an intricate texture of adjacencies and gradients,
I'd like to learn more about how you simulate it, because it's undoubtedly a correct phenomenon, and I think you pointed to something that we really need to get our heads around and have the tools for. But I am interested in the science of the simulation, and that's probably more than we can talk about in that group.
But I wanted to point one more point. When you talk about the psychology of environmental environments, behaviors, and so on, I will look at this, but what I've seen, there's a risk of naturalizing and over-naturalizing this. What would people do in particular conditions is very, very much culturally and so semiologically encoded, and I see it more as a creative project of writing a text and inventing a visual language which differentiate these, rather than something of an over-naturalized, that for instance a dimmed light is always a particular meaning, or a certain color or space form is always associated with it. It's a much more creative project
I would
of
agree.
developing a system of signification.
I would agree, but there's no excuse for ignorance.
So I think this is a good place to end. We can keep the conversation going after this, but I just want to thank all the panelists and especially Patrik Schumacher for joining us. It's been really